Hello, my name is Brian Smith. I research the Darwinian evolution of business models and competitive strategies in pharmaceuticals, medical technology, and other biomedical industries. Today's masterclass is the seventh in a series of 7, all of which are designed for strategists in those industries, and all of which can be found on my YouTube channel. So please look at the others and share them with your colleagues. They are all interconnected and overlap in this subject matter. You can also find over 300 free PDFs on my website, or you can listen to my work on my podcast. Just search for Darwin's Medicine wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you want to talk in particular about how your research or my research can help your company, then please get in touch. So my masterclasses in this series, anyway, are all based on my book, Brand Therapy, which is a manual for making strong strategies in pharma and medtech industries. Brand Therapy and all of my other books are available on Amazon and elsewhere, both in hard copy and electronically. So the material covered today is based on my writing and my academic research, but it's also based on the hands-on work I do when applying this stuff in the real world in pharma and medtech. So this is our agenda for today. I'm going to answer these 3 questions, and if you want to apply these ideas in practice, you're going to need to listen all the way through in order to get the answers to all 3 questions. So let's start with what I mean when I talk about a value proposition. The phrase and the concept arose in the early 1980s. Partly it was McKinsey, partly it was a guy called Ray Kordopleski in his book called Mastering Customer Management. In both cases, the idea was to translate what the firm is offering into a succinct, catchy statement. It was an idea of its time, and it was designed mainly for consumer markets. In this context, the idea of simplifying a message was a good one because the competition depended mostly on communication. And even today, this is the way that most advertising and marketing communications agencies think of the idea of value proposition. But it's not the only way to think about it. It's worth remembering that what those guys said was a simplification, and what they were trying to simplify was an idea that had emerged much earlier, in about 1960, by a guy called E. Jerome McCarthy, something called the marketing mix, or sometimes called the 4 Ps. McCarthy's idea was to make sure that marketers don't forget anything, because he'd observed in his PhD research that marketing strategies often fail, not because there's anything intrinsically wrong with them, but because of what they left out, because they forget something. So the 4 Ps marketing mix was a kind of mnemonic for marketers to make sure you do everything right around the customer. McCarthy's core message was that the customer doesn't just respond to a message, she responds to a whole package, everything she sees, experiences, feels, and receives. There've been lots of variations on the marketing mix idea, but the only one that's really stuck, the only one that's had any significant lasting value, is the 7 Ps model, which came up in the 1980s by 2 guys called Booms and Bittner. And it was meant specifically for markets where the proposition had a very high service element, which is very often the case in medical markets. But the central point remains the same. The attractiveness of what you do to the customer is the aggregate of everything that the customer either receives or experiences, or both intangible and intangible. And you need to get all of these 7 bits right to make it a strong value proposition. So if you work in a market that is like the 1970s consumer markets, and all you care about is marketing communication, then that simpler definition is just fine. But I would argue that my experience in pharma and medtech is that if you work in a market where your product is complex and has a high service content, and the decision involves multiple decision makers like physicians and payers and patients, and the competition is intense and varied, coming from different directions, then this simplified approach just doesn't work. You really need to think of the value proposition in its original, wider sense of the term. That is, the aggregate of products, services, pricing, experiences, and intangibles as it affects the customer's perception of value. So if that's my definition of what a value proposition is, then that leads us on to a question of that I promised to answer of what does a strong value proposition look like? Well, obviously, the ideal value proposition is specific to a market situation. But if you go into pharmaceutical and medical technology companies, as I do, and you ask all these silly questions like, so what works and what doesn't work in a value proposition, then 4 consistent themes emerge. I call them the 4 C's. This is important, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes explaining this before we go on to how to design a strong value proposition, because you need to know what you're trying to achieve. The first characteristic of a strong value proposition is that it must be consistent with your marketing strategy. Remember that your marketing strategy is a statement of what segments you will target and what you will offer to them. So strong value propositions begin with a strong definition of your target market segment. If you saw the segmentation masterclass, then you'll know that a strong definition of a segment must be 4 things: homogeneous, distinct, accessible, viable. If you haven't seen the segmentation masterclass, then I recommend you watch it next. Consistency with a strategy has 2 important implications. First of all, if your strategy defines its targets as categories of customers, for example, a disease condition or a type of physician, then they are not homogeneous, distinct, accessible, viable segments. So you cannot design a strong value proposition around them. You need a better definition of your target segment. Second, it means that if you have a complex marketing strategy that targets more than one segment, then you'll need separate value propositions for each target segment. Its value proposition is by definition specific to a target segment and not to the whole market. So strong value propositions are built around a strong understanding of the needs of a well-defined, homogeneous, distinct, accessible, viable target segment. The second characteristic of a strong value proposition is that it addresses everything that the customer cares about, everything that the target segment cares about. You know, you and I have all been to restaurants with excellent food and great ambience and lots of other things going for it, but we won't go back because one thing was wrong. Perhaps the waiter was rude or the parking was very bad. Similarly, your customers may love your product and your price, but they're put off because of the style of your sales team or because the supporting evidence uses the wrong comparator that they don't care about. Strong value propositions address all the motivating needs of the target segment. The third characteristic of a strong value proposition, the third C, is that its component parts are coherent, meaning that all of the activities involved in the value proposition work together to create a combined effect. So, for example, if you're aiming for an innovative segment with a very sophisticated product, but you employ salespeople who are just standard detailing reps, then that's an incoherent value proposition. If you're aiming for a very critical application that demands a very high level of support, and your help desk is 9 to 5, then that is an inconsistent value proposition. If you're promising the most advanced, well-supported product on the market and your price is designed to undercut everyone in the market, then that is an incoherent value proposition. Customers expect value propositions where all of the elements are in harmony with each other. That's what strong value propositions do. And the last of the 4 C's is that a strong value proposition must be fully costed. And by that, I mean that the resources allocated to it are appropriate, given the work involved, the numbers of customers, the type of customers, the level of competition, appropriate to what you're trying to do. This includes both direct resources, such as advertising spend, and the share of shared resources like sales forces or prominence in your Congress program. A value proposition is a little bit like baking a cake. If you skimp on the ingredients, then it shows. So this is the answer to the first question on my agenda. A value proposition is the aggregate of products, prices, services, experiences, intangibles, everything that affects the customer's perception of the value you're offering. And a strong value proposition has the characteristics of being consistent, complete, coherent, and costed. So that's what you're working towards when we think about how do you design a strong value proposition. So now that we know what we're aiming for, let's consider the second question. There are 3 steps to designing a strong value proposition. That is one that is 4 C's. every one of these 3 steps is necessary. Every one of them is an opportunity to get things right. Every one is also an opportunity to get it wrong, and you need to get all 3 of these steps right. The first step is that you start with strategy. That means before you even begin to think about value proposition design and the details of it, you must do all of your market analyses effectively and then do SWOT effectively. I've covered how to do this in other masterclasses. If you do not have a strong strategy, if you haven't done SWOT properly, then it's close to impossible to design a strong value proposition. Many teams fail to create a strong value proposition. They simply fill in templates, their analyses are weak, and they don't use SWOT effectively. As a consequence, their value propositions are often weak. The second essential step is to identify fully those needs of the target segment that drive its behavior. What most teams do here is that they think about the clinical or technical needs of the patient, or sometimes the profession. That's wrong. Remember, a segment is not the same as a category of customers, such as a type of professional or type of patient. In biomedical markets, the segment is usually a context, meaning you need to consider the needs of the patient, the professionals, and the payer, all of them at once. Again, if this isn't clear, go back to my segmentation masterclass. And the second thing I need you to remember about the needs of a target segment is that a segment has multiple levels of needs, and that the value proposition needs to address all of these levels. The core needs are the things that we usually get right, that if we don't get them right, we just can't enter the market at all. The extended needs are the needs that we sometimes get right, but we often fail to meet completely. These are the needs that if you don't address them, it means that your core offer doesn't work properly. So, things like training and support and information. The augmented needs are the ones that are most often either neglected or misunderstood by marketing teams. These are the needs that are most likely to influence behavior and win you advantage in mature markets when there isn't much difference between the core products. Augmented needs typically relate to your customers' emotional and tangible needs, such as self-actualization. And again, we need to think about all of the augmented needs of all the stakeholders involved in the contextual segment, not just the patient or the professional. The important point to grasp here is that a full understanding of these needs is needed before you begin to build a value proposition, because that's what you're going to be working around. And don't forget that we're not talking about the needs of the market as a whole, we're talking about the needs of your target segment. And the needs of each segment in the marketplace will differ slightly. The segment, of course, is a context, not a category, and these needs are in 3 levels. So you need to get your head around this idea before you start designing a value proposition. I know it's tempting to rush into try and you've got all these ideas about how to address the market, but this is the vital foundation work you do before building a value proposition. So let's assume you've got those 2 things right, the strategy right, especially the nature of the contextual segment, and you've understood the needs of the contextual segment. Only then can you move on to the next step of developing the value proposition. Our challenge here is to put together a collection of activities and programs that is complete, that is addresses the needs of all the needs of the targeted contextual segment, and is coherent. All of those activities reinforce each other and don't contradict each other. Now, it should be obvious by now, the place to start with this is with the needs of the targeted segment. And then you assemble your value creating programs and activities around those needs. That's what customer centricity actually means. Despite its age, the 7 Ps model remains a pretty good way to build a value proposition. But you need to use it intelligently and not just use it as a simple checklist. The trick here in using 7 Ps correctly is to ask how each of the 7 Ps can address or can be made to address the needs of that target segment. For example, you might consider how the distribution channel may be designed to meet the segment's needs. In medical devices, firms often use inventory management processes to address customers' extended needs to be never out of stock, even when there's a large number of SKUs. That would be the use of place. Same goes with pricing. Don't just set the price, think about how the pricing level and the structure can meet the needs of the target segment. For example, pricing can be used to meet the needs of peers for reassurance. It's a higher level augmented needs. Reassurance about budgetary controls, for example, in risk, by using a risk-sharing pricing agreement. We can do the same thing with physical evidence, especially when there's a high service component to your offer. So, for example, in some chronic diseases, asthma, diabetes, smart devices and apps can be used to meet the patient's needs to feel in control. And professionals' need for information about adherence is also met by smart devices and apps. So this is using the physical evidence part of the 7 Ps mix. Process offers a huge opportunity to address the needs of the target segment, especially when there's a high degree of customization involved. So if you look at what companies like GE or Siemens or Philips do during the process of setting up their hardware, then the same thing can be done in, for example, CAM service agreements in pharma, key account management service agreements in pharma. That's an example of using process to address the needs of the target segment. Your choice of the use of people can often be used to meet the self-actualization needs of advanced or sophisticated users. So, for example, the use of medical science liaison people rather than salespeople in some areas of oncology, or the use of highly trained health economics people to work with budget holders. That's use of people in the 7 Ps mix. The most obvious of the 7 Ps, promotion, the most visible one, is typically people think about it just to convey information, but used intelligently, it can be used to meet a patient's higher needs, the augmented needs, to engage emotionally with the brand. This is sometimes done in some lifestyle products, for example, such as in smoking cessation or in obesity management. And the most central of the 7 Ps product can obviously be used to meet the core needs of efficacy and safety and so on. But in medical devices, especially those that are physically handled, the design of the product can be used to meet the user's need to feel trust in the product. Or in pharma, things like packaging and delivery systems can be used to meet some patient emotional needs for trust. Obviously, the detail of how you build a marketing mix around the needs of the targeted contextual segment is very case specific. But the important point here is that these activities must be consistent with the needs of that segment, and they must reinforce each other. They mustn't leave any needs unmet, and they must provide appropriate and sufficient resources to deliver all this activity. That's the 4 Cs. Of course, you might have already guessed it, an alternative and sometimes complementary way of doing this that I often use in practice is to start with the target needs segments, but instead of using the 7 Ps model, or as well as using the 7 Ps model, you come at it from the structure of your company. So you ask what each of the functions, Marcoms, market access, medical affairs, regulatory, what can they do? How does their activity meet the needs, the 3 levels of needs of the targeted contextual segment? This is a very powerful tool to get when you're working in a cross-functional way. So the answer to our second question, how to design a strong value proposition, is you start with a strategy which defines the target contextual segment. Then you work out very thoroughly what the needs of that segment are, and you build the 7 Ps and you build the programs around those needs. In principle, it sounds very easy, but most firms find this really difficult. And that's the question, that's the issue I wanted to address in my last question. You see, nobody ever gets up in the morning wanting to deliver a weak value proposition, but many companies do. And I've long been interested in this phenomenon. Why do pharma and medtech companies full of very, very bright people quite often make weak value propositions? In my research, I identified 4 sets of organizational behavior reasons for this. The first is what I call permissive strategic ambiguity. This is when leaders fail to be clear and precise about what the strategy is. Sometimes this is accidental, sometimes it's incompetence, but most often it's deliberate. That is, because leaders do it because allowing ambiguity about strategy allows teams to avoid conflict. Permissive strategic ambiguity is fixed by saying exactly what you mean. So you write a strategy statement using a tool called Drucker's definition. Again, that's in the brand therapy book. Be absolutely clear about what terms like segment and value proposition mean. You don't be fuzzy about their meaning. And then use the strategy statement to guide execution. At every step of the way, you say, how does this tactic fit or not fit with the strategy statement? The second disabler of a value proposition is interorganizational conflict. This is when departments conflict negatively. It's caused when objectives and goals are in conflict with each other, like for instance, sales and profit targets, but also when department leaders demand loyalty to themselves rather than to the company, something called group salience. And it's also amplified when departments are physically separated around the world or in different buildings, so don't get to speak to each other much. You manage interorganizational conflict by preventing middle managers from creating too much team loyalty at the expense of company loyalty. Company loyalty is called organizational salience. You do this by avoiding goals and bonuses systems that conflict with each other, and by encouraging socialization outside of the work agenda. Easier said than done, but that's just what you need to do. The third factor that hinders value proposition execution is too little cross-functional working. That is, too little sharing of knowledge and expertise in support of each other. The usual causes of this are differing professional cultures between teams. So if you think, for example, about medical versus sales, you'll know that they have different subcultures within those functions. It's amplified by too little understanding of how different functions work, people not understanding each other's jobs, and by too little time to explain to each other. So those three causes are addressed by three solutions. You fix this by making sure that everybody understands what are the critical alignment issues within the strategy. If you don't know what that term means, look at my SWOT alignment masterclass. Critical alignment issues is what comes out of your SWOT. By ensuring that team leaders understand how the overall business works, that is, having team leaders with T-shaped skills, functional skills, I-shaped skills, and T-shaped skills where they understand the breadth of the company. And the third thing you do is you allow time for issues to be worked out, which means sometimes cutting some slack in the schedules. Something called organizational slack in the jargon. And the final, and perhaps the most surprising issue, is too much cross-functional working. And what I mean by this is too much cross-functional working is when every decision is made by committee and nothing gets done because everyone spends so much time aligning with each other and not making decisions. It's the implementational equivalent, the organizational equivalent of 7-year-olds playing football. If you've ever seen a bunch of 7-year-old boys playing football, you have 22 people within 1 meter of the ball, all kicking like crazy, and nobody is playing their position. It's the equivalent of that. This is caused by weak leadership. It's caused by lack of trust, and it's caused by an immature culture. You address this by clear role demarcation, so the leader says, you do this job, you do this job, you do this job. By effective delegation of roles, and by developing a cultural norm within the organization that teamwork means deciding, delegating, and doing, and it doesn't mean spending all day aligning and avoiding difficult choices. And of course, that sort of cultural norm setting comes from the top of the organization. So these 4 factors are what stop firms who have designed a value proposition from executing it. Generally speaking, a good, strong value proposition makes it easy for a team to execute it. All you need to do is remove these 4 organizational barriers from stopping them doing it. So here's the answer to the final question. Your organization already wants to deliver a strong value proposition. You don't need to make them want to do it. You need to remove the things that are stopping them. And those 4 things, strategic ambiguity, interorganizational conflict, too little cross-functional working, too much cross-functional working, for each of those 4 things, we have good solutions for it, but it does require leadership. So I'm going to close now by asking you a question. how strong, how good do you think your value proposition is? Do you think it's as good as it could be? This slide summarizes the differences that I see in my research between best practice in value proposition and typical practice in value proposition. Which of these do you think, the left or the right, best describes as the most accurate description of what you do now? Because if you think you're more to the left than to the right, then that's an opportunity for you to improve how you make and deliver your value propositions. Generally, to get from the left to the right, what needs to be done is more thought. It generally doesn't need more people or more resources, it just needs more thought and more leadership. Again, if you want to talk about the practicalities of doing this in your organization, then please get in touch. So that's the end of my presentation. That's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you very much for watching Masterclass. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe, please like, please mention to your friends and colleagues on LinkedIn and Twitter. I hope you'll get to watch some of my other masterclasses. And if you'd like to know more about how to apply these ideas in your company, then please contact me directly. I'm always happy to set up a virtual coffee and have a talk to you about it. I enjoy talking to people who, like me, love our industry. Thank you very much for listening.